So my name is Vijay Chauhan. I run product marketing with Illumio, based out on the West Coast. And I'm going to talk to you today about zero trust with zero fuss. And what we mean by that is, I think when you first get exposed to zero trust, it can appear to be a little bit daunting. And what I want to get across, if nothing else, is that you can tackle it piecemeal. You can tackle it in an iterative approach. And I guess, as with any good risk management program that you run, security or otherwise, you want to baseline yourself, you want to keep tracking and monitoring how you're doing, and then move on from there. So here's what we're going to cover. Why is it that we're talking about zero trust exactly? What is it? I want to introduce micro-segmentation, because that sometimes gets used synonymously with zero trust. And then how might you want to implement zero trust with my company, which is Illumio. So here's really the primary reason that I see, or primary set of reasons that I see behind why, in 2019, did we really need yet another security framework, right? We've already got a long list of them. Really, did we need another one? And I'd argue that timing may be debatable, but yes, we probably did need a new way of looking at things. And the primary set of reasons, like I said, are that modern enterprises look a little bit like this. There is the breaking down of what we call monolithic applications into microservices. And as a result, it means that workloads are now very short-lived. They're ephemeral. They spin up and they spin down. So that's what I mean by dynamic. Our environments are also amalgamations of the different pieces of infrastructure that we've picked up over time. Bare metal, containers, VMs, and more often instances in the cloud. So we have very heterogeneous environments. And I'm not even talking about the OS. If you think about all of the OSs and the different versions of OSs that you have within your organization, and then you layer on the different variety of applications that you have, we have very heterogeneous environments. Distributed, really we're talking about how you need to, for geodiversity and for geo-resiliency, we spread our workloads and we spread our applications across multiple data centers. That's a very natural motion that we've seen for multiple decades now. And last but not least, environments are, I don't want to say folks are migrating to the cloud, because that suggests that once everything is in the cloud, you're kind of done. I think folks are at various stages of building out their cloud footprints. And maybe 100% cloud is not necessarily the final destination. But you're going to find lots of organizations are at varying degrees of being hybrid. And another phenomenon that we're seeing is that, yes, there are the leaders with respect to IaaS and PaaS when you talk about cloud providers. There's the one that you all know, but there's also the other two. There's also GCP and Azure along with AWS. And I think what we are seeing, certainly in our customer base, is, again, for resiliency purposes and sometimes just for good risk management and the multi-vendor policies that a lot of companies have, you're going to see all of those cloud providers. All in all, our old ways, our traditional legacy ways of protecting our environments were not really set up to handle these modern enterprises. And one of the key things, one of the key changes is that we used to have this perimeter model of security. And that's changing because we can no longer, the picture you see on the left-hand side, where everything goes through, all traffic goes through a single choke point, that's no longer applicable because our environments are looking more and more like the right-hand side. And that presents a number of challenges. And here enters zero trust. So we've heard a little bit about zero trust, but I agree with the comments from my colleagues in the previous presentations that in many ways, zero trust is this elephant, and I think you need to try and grab different parts of that elephant in order to understand it. And it's possible that we may not fully appreciate what zero trust is, but I'd like to give some insights into how at least I think about what zero trust is. So I think of zero trust as a way of thinking, a philosophy, a mindset. Now, if I was to stop there, then you'd say, okay, that's great. That sounds very theoretical, right? When you speak about philosophy. But I believe in applied philosophy. And so hence I've added in the word framework as well. And the fine folks at Forrester, we just saw, Chase Cunningham's bio was up there. He's kind of leading the charge together with his colleagues at Forrester. They're making tremendous efforts to take what is a philosophy and turn it into a framework. Make it something that is applicable and something that can be applied within your organizations. Now, when I first heard the term zero trust, the beginning of the germination of that thought in my head was, you can't think about zero trust without beginning with assuming breach. And what do I mean by that? Assume breach is this attitude, is this thinking that you have already been breached. Your environment today, whether you realize it or not, the adversary is already in your environment. Now just let that kind of soak in for a moment, because if you genuinely believe that, you're not just paying lip service, right? If you genuinely believe the attacker is already on my network, then the way you make decisions, your thinking, your philosophy, and therefore your strategy is going to shift. And so that's a really key point for me. Assume breach is that mentality that you have already got the adversary living. A lot of you may be familiar with the term dwell time, right? You often hear about dwell time of an adversary being in the tens of days or even hundreds of days. And there's some geographical variation around dwell time. So the adversary is already in your environment. So now make all of your decisions around security based on the fact that the attacker is already in your home. Now, when you make that assumption that the attacker is already on your network, it makes this idea of this side of the perimeter is unsafe and bad, and that's where the attackers live. And this side of the perimeter is safe. It's my corporate network. It's trusted and is good. It throws that paradigm away because the bad guys are already on your network. And so this idea of perimeter being the divider of inside and outside, that goes away, and actually that becomes an enabler for your business. We heard about least privileges. This is a term that has grown up in the identity and access management space. And what Zero Trust has done is it's taken that incredible concept and it has extended it beyond just identity and access management. We also heard about this idea that you typically want to trust but verify. The shift is now happening to never trust but always verify. When you hear the term default deny, that also tells you that you are in zero trust land, right? If you hear that phrase. But there's two sides to that coin, right? Default deny means by default, you get no permission. So you get no privileges. Just because you're on the network, just because you're on the corporate network, just because you're on the campus network, you get no privileges by default. That's what default deny means. But there's a flip side to that, because if we gave nobody access to anything, it'd be a little bit difficult for us to conduct business. So the flip side of that coin is a whitelisting approach. So what we're saying is, by default, you don't get access to anything, but in certain situations, you can have access if it has been explicitly, knowingly been authorized. Now, one thing that I'm learning about Zero Trust, and this has been a little bit more recent, probably in the last, I'd say, 3 to 6 months, is that Zero Trust, if it's really going to be successful, it's going to need to expand beyond just security. And I know maybe I'm probably jumping a little bit ahead of myself because the security community is only just starting to appreciate and understand Zero Trust. And here I am saying Zero Trust needs to, no pun intended or pun fully intended, it needs to go beyond the perimeter of security. But my point here is that typically in most organizations, where do you get breached? You get breached at this place that we call the weakest link, which is typically the human being. And I want to give some examples of where there are parts of your organization outside of security that need to take on a zero trust approach. I love the help desk example, right? If I'm, training to be a help desk analyst, kind of 101 of my training is the customer, the client is always right. That's kind of been drummed into, corporate North America. The customer is always right. I loved when I first moved over to the US from the UK, when I was able to buy something from one store and take it to another store for a different chain and get a refund. They didn't even ask me or care about the fact that I'd bought it from retailer X and I'd taken it to retailer Y. That's how ingrained this mentality of the customer is always right is within our organization. So a help desk analyst definitely is trying to be helpful, is trying to navigate for that individual what their problem is. You've got to balance that with, am I giving away too much information? There is any number of YouTube videos. You guys can maybe even right now search for YouTube videos that show you how folks have been socially engineered, how people at help desks have been socially engineered into giving away any number of very confidential pieces of information about other people. So it's important that zero trust extends to your help desk. Another example is developers. Who's familiar here with, by show of hands, who's familiar with the OWASP top 10? Or you've at least heard of it. Awesome. So a lot of you will already know that the OWASP top 10 is the web application security risks. And it's been around for at least a decade, maybe 15 or so years. And it's largely been static. The list of items has largely been static. For that, at least for that last decade or so. And if I think about what is number 1, number 2, number 3, and so on and so forth, and then I apply a zero trust lens to those top 3 or 4, I think the first one is injection, which kind of covers all the different varieties of injection. SQL injection might be one that you're most familiar with. Injection is really about sanitizing the input. If I know that within the web page that I've created, the input should be a 8-digit number, there is no reason for me to accept a long string of characters. Apply zero trust lens, and automatically that particular OWASP top 1, I think it is number 1, starts to dissolve away. And there are others. There is insecure or broken authentication, that's another one. And then there is the exposure of sensitive data. So where we are giving back to the client, you're giving away more information than was actually required. Now apply a zero trust lens to that. So we need to be training our developers, and maybe some of you here are developers, to think with a zero trust mindset, even though they might not be in the security team. All right. All in all, zero trust is everyone's responsibility. I once worked at a bank, Barclays Bank, where we had the obligatory kind of giveaway pen. And in the pen, as you clicked it, different messages would come out. And one of the messages was security is everyone's responsibility. If I had to create that pen again, I'd probably replace it with zero trust is everyone's responsibility. I think that's the only way that it really becomes successful. Now, I want to introduce micro-segmentation. And it might seem a little bit out of place. You're like, okay, Vijay, you're here to talk about zero trust. Where on earth did this extremely long word come from? The reason I want to bring it up is sometimes, and certainly in the early days of zero trust was synonymous with micro-segmentation. And I think that had its pros, it had its cons. Fortunately, like I said, the folks at Forrester are starting to expand the definition of zero trust so that you can look at all of these other aspects, so that you can look at identity, as we just heard. You can look at devices, you can look at workloads, you can look at the network. But micro-segmentation is really this idea that I'm going to explain to you now. So you'll recognize this as the blueprint for most major breaches that make the news. And the important part is kind of that third big bubble. That third bubble represents the movement of the adversary, of the attacker, which we call lateral movement. You'll also sometimes hear it being referred to as east-west traffic, right? If you think of northwest traffic as being into and out of the organization through the perimeter, east-west traffic refers to lateral movement inside of the perimeter. So when an attacker is trying to get into your organization, the number one thing they want to do is they want to grab a hold of something that we call a beachhead, right? That's a military term. You want to grab hold of a beachhead within the organization, which is perhaps a low-value asset. And then from that low-value asset, I'll bring in another military term, you then want to do a island hopping campaign within the organization. And what I mean by that is you jump from one server, from one host to another, until eventually you get to what we call your crown jewels, your high-value asset, the thing that you actually, as an attacker, are trying to expose and you're trying to get your hands on. That is the blueprint for all breaches. There are very few deviations from that blueprint. And so it makes you think, wait a second, we kind of know the modus operandi, the MO of attackers. Why don't we try and address that MO? In particular, why don't we try and address the lateral movement portion of that methodology? And so let me show you this quick video, if it works. And what I want to show here is that if you want to restrict lateral movement, you need to compartmentalize. Because if you don't compartmentalize, like the submarine on the right, you will sink. And what I'm trying to say by you will sink is that on the right-hand side, fortunately, this is how we construct submarines today. It's not like the one on the left. Fortunately, after decades of endeavors, we've worked out how to do that correctly. You have these things called bulkheads, and those bulkheads separate different compartments. Now imagine that folks are spending many months on these moving vessels. So yes, it's going to restrict your movement to some degree. But in the event of a breach, you are localizing, and when I say breach, I mean breach from the perspective of water infiltrating your environment. It is localized to that particular segment where the breach took place. And the submarine can continue to function. Maybe it's going to go a little bit slower. Maybe it's going to need to take a pit stop somewhere so that it can recover from that breach, but it can continue versus what we saw on the left. So micro-segmentation, right, that's the section of the presentation we're in right now, is akin to this submarine diagram. In an enterprise environment, how do I split up my environment so that when an attacker does manage to get in, they are localized. They're not able to hide, and they're not able to perform that island hopping campaign that we spoke about. Here's a quick quote from Chase Cunningham in a recent blog. He said, "Zero Trust is strategically focused on addressing the lateral threat movement." Right? And one way that you can do it, and I agree 100% with the comments from my colleagues previously, like there is no single product that is going to solve zero trust for you. And if anyone says that to you, you've got to pull the BS flag on those individuals, right? But this is certainly one very powerful, very elegant technique, and it's called micro-segmentation. Now you might say, okay, this idea of segmenting is not new. And you're right. Segmenting is not new. It's been around for as long as we've been connecting computers together in order to create networks. And we've been doing it using network constructs and network infrastructure. So we've been using firewalls to do that north-south. We've been using routers and ACLs at the intersection of networks. And we've been using VLANs on switches, which effectively create what we call a broadcast network, but it's a localized broadcast network. So we've been doing segmentation. We've been approaching it from a networks angle, but we've been doing segmentation for at least 3 decades. So yes, it's not new at all. But what we found, and what many customers, not just our own, have found, is that those constructs don't give you the visibility that you need in order to implement a zero trust strategy. So yes, you can see packets moving from one place to another. And let's remember what networks are. Networks have been there and are there for the efficient and reliable routing of packets, period. This requirement that we have all kind of superimposed around security is an artificial requirement that we've applied. And what we're suggesting is you can decouple those two. So number one, you don't have visibility into how are your applications interacting, because how can you possibly implement zero trust if you can't see what needs to be segmented. The other piece is, who here has ever either read, written, or had to approve a firewall rule? How much fun is that, right? And now imagine in a typical enterprise, in a typical firewall, bearing in mind that most enterprises have dozens of these firewalls and they always appear in pairs, and typically you have the famous firewall sandwich, right? You've got an outer tier and you've got an inner tier of firewalls. What human being in your organization could possibly say, I understand the sequence, by the way, sequence matters in firewall rules. If you order firewalls differently, you get a different outcome. But what individual could possibly say, I understand what the intended outcome of these firewall rules is? Very few people. Which leads me to the third point. Who's ever got that phone call in the middle of the night because you misconfigured a rule on a firewall, right? You either opened up something far more open than it should have been, but more likely you actually, because of the ordering, you actually broke something. All right, I'm going to skip through some of these. Let me get to the micro-segmentation approaches that are available to you today. The network-based approach we've already spoken about. So that's where you're using firewalls, you're using routers, you're using switches. But you may also have a highly virtualized environment. Maybe you're using VMware, KVM, Hyper-V, right? Or any combination of these. We see a lot of organizations that are actually multi-hypervisor for the same reasons that I mentioned earlier. In those environments, you could use the hypervisor to perform the segmentation, right? You're already using the hypervisor to create what we call a software-defined network. You could also do the segmentation at that layer. But typically, you're going to be restricted and you're going to be locked into a particular vendor. It doesn't work across hypervisors. You may also be restricted from being able to control your bare metal servers. What do you do about your containers? What do you do about your cloud workloads? And then our approach is segmenting at the workload. Now, this is where everyone takes a deep breath because you say, yet another agent? You're expecting me to deploy yet another agent? And my argument would be, you shouldn't be looking at it from that perspective. You should be looking at it from the perspective of which agent in my environment today can I take out so that I can make space for this particular agent. And what we do is we instrument, you may not realize it, but you already have all the firewalls you will ever need in every one of your operating systems. So in Windows, it's called Windows Filtering Platform. In Linux, it's called IP tables. And AIX and Solaris has something similar called IP filter. But what you've never had is a way to instrument those firewalls so that they can act together in unison, right? So you can effectively create a micro perimeter of the design or shape of your wish based on the individual firewalls that sit in every one of your workloads. And so that's the magic, that's the secret sauce in our solution. We will manage all of those firewalls so that they act in concert. All right. I think I've got about 2 minutes left. Let's whiz through these. So here are the steps that we have identified. So we saw a little bit earlier the 5 steps that Forrester has prescribed around Zero Trust. Here's what we see. And there's a lot of overlap. You'll see a lot of things that are parallel. The first one is you've got to have a map. You can't segment what you can't see. You can't secure what you can't see. You can't baseline, and you can't treat this as a risk management exercise if you can't see what is the communications between and across your applications. So get a map. The second thing we see is please make sure that you have a way of modeling and testing your policy before you flip the switch. Remember, Zero Trust is taking us from this model of everyone has access to everything to no one has access to anything unless you've been explicitly authorized. You don't want to screw that up. And so you want to make sure you're able to test and model policy before you go into enforcement mode. So make sure you have a solution or a set of solutions that are going to allow you to do that. And then when you're ready to flip that switch, right, when you're ready to enforce, like I said, what our solution is going to do is going to program those native layer 3, layer 4 stateful firewalls that you already have living within every one of your workloads. Now, here's something that, again, I've only really noticed in the last probably 6 months or so. Who here has or is aware of a vulnerability management system within their enterprise? So maybe like a Qualys or a Tenable or a Rapid7. Right, I'd expect that pretty much every environment does have that. What we do is we can ingest that vulnerability information and we will overlay it on top of our map. So now what do you have? You have a map that shows you what is speaking with what, but now you also have information about what is vulnerable. So if you have two vulnerabilities, you have two different workloads with the same vulnerability, one of them is very chatty, it's talking to a number of other workloads, and one is isolated, it's sitting there on its own. Which one do you care about patching first? You probably want to patch this guy over here, the one that is communicating with a number of different things. So what our map has done, and we call it a vulnerability map, is it's combined this idea of exploitability, right, which is the information that your vulnerability management system is going to give you, with reachability. Because when you put those two things together, that is risk. Exploitability plus reachability. All right, last but not least, and this is kind of cheating because step 5 is not a step per se. It's something that needs to be applied in each of the previous 4 steps. But you got to make sure that your zero trust solutions can be integrated with your existing operations, security operations, network operations, your DevOps team. You want to make sure that when the DevOps team is spinning up workloads, that security is baked in. Security is there from the beginning. We call it security from birth. All right. What does success look like? I kind of spoke to these things already. You need to have visibility. You need to be able to model your policy. You need to be able to pick the level of granularity of your policy. It needs to be dynamic. As workloads move around, the policy should follow the workload. You need to be able to quantify your risk. If you have that ability to say, here is what the risk was before, and here is what it is afterwards, that makes for a much better conversation with your management, and especially when it comes to the board level. And then you need to be able to report. There's this saying that compliance is in the eye of the beholder, and actually compliance is in the eye of the auditor. So it's all very good you thinking that you have implemented zero trust. But if you can't report on it, if you don't have that auditability, then you might as well not be doing it. Here are some of the folks that have taken this journey with us. And the interesting thing is, if you were to ask them, they may not use the word zero trust. They may not say, yeah, we're working with Illumio on zero trust. But under the covers, they are taking a zero trust journey without necessarily realizing it. Here are just 2 of the use cases that we see. We're at RBC, so I thought let me use some financial services type use cases. PCI DSS and Swift is the other one. Those are both controls or both standards where there is a strong element that require you to segment off some portion of your environment. So if you're familiar with PCI DSS, there's this idea of cardholder data environment. Your CDE environment needs to be separated from the rest of your environment. If you don't, you're going to have a very interesting audit. Your audit is basically going to be your entire enterprise. And then Swift, right? We all know about the famous Bangladesh breach, which kind of kicked in motion a number of controls, and in particular the Swift CSP controls. There's a bunch of great write-ups on how that came to be. We have a number of other use cases as well. Come and grab me. Dan Tisello, who's standing at the back over there, he's our Canada contact. If you want to learn more about the product, thank you very much. You guys have been awesome.